Hello, student. I'm Professor Smita Jha, and I'm here to discuss once again Thomas Hardy and his background, the novel during the Victorian age. Thomas Hardy was born June 2, 1840, in Higher Bockhampton, Dorset, England, the same place where he died there 88 years later. The town where Hardy was born, Higher Bockhampton, was poor, but Hardy was born into a line of skilled laborers. His father was a master mason, as was his grandfather, and throughout his childhood it was assumed that Hardy would be a mason also. In 1856, he was apprenticed to an architect and went to live in Dorchester, the country seat, where he was to live for most of his life. After gaining full status as an architect, Hardy took up writing poetry, but was not successful in getting his works published, and so he turned to writing fiction. In all, he published 14 novels between 1871 and 1895. His first novel, Desperate Remedies, was published in 1871. In 1872, he published Under the Greenwood Tree anonymously, and in 1873, he published A Pair of Blue Eyes. None of these initial works garnered much critical attention from the literary establishment. Far from the Madding Crowd is considered the first Hardy's 5 important novels. The other 4 are The Return of the Native, The Mayor of Casterbridge, Tess of D'Urville's, and Judy the Obscure. While these 5 novels are considered important works in the canon of British literature, Hardy published numerous other novels, short story, sketches, travel writings, and poetry that received less attention. Hardy's novels are known for their frank portrayals of love and sexuality, and as a result, he was subject to harsh social criticism in his time. After the publication of Jude the Obscure, he grew tired of being surrounded by controversy, and so he gave up writing fiction and focused on poetry. His distinguished poetry career lasted for more than 30 years until his death on January 11, 1928. In December 1872, having already published several moderately successful novels, Thomas Hardy was approached by the editor of Cornhill, a respected literary magazine, to write a story to run in serial form. The resulting book, Far from the Madding Crowd, was a popular attraction for the magazine and Hardy's first critical success. It was first published between January and December 1874, then published in London in book form the same year. Hardy had already published several novels, but this was the first of the 5 novels that would ensure his place in the annals of literature. The plot of Far from the Madding Crowd concerns a young woman, Bathsheba Everden, and the 3 men in her life. One is a poor sheep farmer who loses his flock in a tragedy and ends up working as an employee on Bathsheba's farm. One is the respectable, boring owner of neighboring farm who takes Bathsheba's flirtations too seriously. And the third is a dashing army sergeant who treats her like just another of his conquest. In chronicling their hopes, plans, and disappointments, Hardy presents to reader a clear example of Victorian romanticism. At the same time, his understanding of the lives of farmers and ranchers in rural England makes him a forerunner to the realistic tradition in literature. Wessex, the location far from the Madding Crowd, is an imaginary English country that Hardy colored with fine details throughout the course of his writing career. It is similar to Dorset, where Hardy lived most of his life, but its fictitious nature gave the author freedom to describe the landscape at will. Hardy wrote Far from the Madding Crowd in the same Dorset cottage in which he was born and which his grandfather had built in 1800. Though fictional, the residents of Wessex farmers, landowners, laborers, servants, and the like are considered 2 representations of people living at the time the novel was published. Far from the Madding Crowd is one of Thomas Hardy's happier novels, which is to say, it ends happily. This being Hardy, there is much unhappiness along the way, even while it contains the desperate death of a young woman and newborn baby, a murder and attempted suicide, betrayal inside and outside marriage, and the usual Hardyesque havoc wrought by nature or accident. It turns finally in a benevolent direction. Far from the Madding Crowd is Hardy's fifth written novel, but arguably his first major work, and it comes at a significant juncture. The years from 1870 to 1874 see him poised uncertainly between his work as a jobbing architect and his prospects and ambitions as a writer, and they contain several decisive events in his life. At the start of 1870, his 38th birthday approaching, and one unpublished failed novel, The Poor Man and the Lady Behind Him, Hardy was working on a second, Desperate Remedies. His early love, his cousin Tryphena, had moved to London, and Hardy was withdrawing from the relationship. In March, he contracted with his sometime employer, architect John Hicks, to work on a church restoration in St. Juliet, Cornwall. Here he met Emma Gifford, who, after a protracted courtship, would become his wife, and she encouraged his writing ambitions. In March 1871, Desperate Remedies was published by William Tinsley in 3 volumes. Hardy had his first novel out in the world. He lost no time, and in spite of the competing demands of his architectural work, by August 1871, Under the Greenwood Tree was completed and eventually published in June 1872 in 2 volumes, again by Tinsley. Tinsley now offered his increasingly successful novelist the opportunity of a serialized novel for the handsome sum of £200, and by August of 1872, Hardy sent off the first installment of A Pair of Blue Eyes. The speed of writing and publication demonstrated here would bewilder the contemporary novelist and they remind us of Hardy's hard work and commitment. He was also completing architectural contrast. The offer of serialization of A Pair of Blue Eyes also enabled him, as it did other novelists, to publish early parts of a work before later parts were completed or even imagined. Hardy, at any rate, now felt sufficiently successful in his writing career to ask Emma's father for formal permission to marry her, which was summarily refused. This, however, seemed only to have stoked the fires. The two were between themselves unofficially betrothed, and Emma's residence at her brother-in-law's in St. Juliet rather than at her parents' home meant that the relationship could flourish. It was at this point, late in 1872, that Leslie Stephen, editor of the prestigious Cornhill magazine, approached Hardy with the offer of serializing any new novel he might have in progress. Stephen had read Under the Greenwood Tree and found his descriptions admirable. Hardy, who was delighted by the proposal, replied that he had in mind a pastoral tale with the title Far from the Madding Crowd, in which the chief characters would probably be a young woman farmer, a shepherd, and a sergeant of cavalry. So, this new novel began on an upsurge of increasing success and recognition as a writer, with accompanying financial rewards. Alongside the hopeful beginning of his life partnership with Emma, who at this point was both as strongly supportive of and closely involved in his work. Furthermore, much of the novel was written at his old family home of Bockhampton, surrounded by the rustic life that would be so significant in Far from the Madding Crowd. Hardy went back to the well springs of his imagination and the story he had sketched to Leslie Stephen involving a young woman farmer, a shepherd, and a sergeant of cavalry now grew into what is generally regarded as his first fully mature novel. almost a year later. In September 1873, he submitted the first 10 chapters of the novel. Leslie Stephen, who was dismayed by the sexual content of the novel, heavily censored the book prior to publication in the magazine. This serialization began in January 1874. The writing of the whole was finished in July. He and Emma were married in September, and the complete two-volume novel was published in November. Hardy, the novelist, and the man was finally launched. Because both the serial and the book versions were well received, Hardy could now abandon architecture and devote himself completely to his literary career. Indeed, Hardy's sly profanities, including the farmhand's casual reference of the Bible when talking about country love affairs, got him into trouble in Victorian society. But the Victorians were also concerned about maintaining a stability and coherence in a world in which the past no longer seemed to provide a model for the future. After the publication of Jude the Obscure caused a major scandal in 1895, Hardy stopped writing novels and devoted the rest of his life, more than 30 years, to poetry. His last great project was an epic poem titled The Dynasts, a versed chronicle of the Napoleonic War. After some time in London, he built himself a house in his native Dorset and lived there for the rest of his life. Hardy was a devoted reader of philosophy, scientific texts, the Bible, and Greek literature, and he incorporated much of his knowledge into his own works. One of the most profound influences on his thinking was Charles Darwin, particularly Darwin's emphasis on chance and luck in evolution. Though brought up to believe in God, Hardy struggled with the loss of faith suffered by many of his contemporaries. He increasingly turned to science for answers about man's place in the universe. Far from the Madding Crowd largely takes place in the countryside, and the literal meaning of the title, a place far away from the crazed, wild crowd, evokes an atmosphere of calm and tranquility. This was partly a reaction of Hardy's on account of the birth of industrialization around the time of writing, when the English countryside was a refuge from the noise and smog of the new industries. Additionally, Far from the Madding Crowd was Hardy's first real success in novel writing and was made famous through his evocative images of country life, as well as being the first time in his literary works in which he introduced his Wessex. As a result, perhaps by mirroring the English countryside, he made his Wessex more familiar to contemporary readers. In some ways, Wessex seems exempt from such changes, but the outside world does enter in, as when Troy wants to become a modern farmer with new techniques and methods. While urban modernity is not a part of Far from the Madding Crowd, the philosophical and psychological questions of modernity, people's place within a new frightening world, can be teased out from its pages. The contrasting relationship between Bathsheba and her suitors provides a study of the many faces of love, including honest, heartfelt love, and unscrupulous and manipulative adoration. The story is about love, honor, and betrayal, and it's set in a farming community in Victorian England, which seems like a perfect place but is often hard. His book is about how important it is for people to be connected to and understand the natural world. Gabriel Oak is Hardy's idea of a person who lives in balance with the forces of nature. Madding is a synonym for frenzied. In this context, Gray is idealizing noiseless and sequestered calm, whereas Hardy disrupts the idyll, and not just by introducing the sound and fury of an extreme plot. He is out to subvert his reader's complacency. Here is Christina Winfield in her notes to the New Wessex edition of the novel. 5 chapter characters from Far from the Madding Crowd reappear elsewhere in Hardy's work. Gatekeeper Day in Under the Greenwood Tree, Long the Casterbridge lawyer in chapter 37 of The Mayor of Casterbridge, while farmers Everdeen and Baldwood are among the creditors present at Michael Hencher's bankruptcy. Lastly, Parson, thirdly, the Vicar of Witherbury, makes a brief appearance in Channel Firing, a poem composed in 1914 about the dead who were awakened in their coffins by the gunnery practice at sea just before the First World War. These cross references to other novels suggest that Hardy imagines the action as taking place in the early 1816s, though C.J. Weber on calendar evidence has proposed the letter date of 1869-73. Digging out Weber's article chronology in Hardy's novels, it can be found that he confidently assigns the following dates to the novel: 1841, birth of Gabriel Oak; 1849, birth of Bathsheba; 1845, birth of Troy; 1850, birth of Fanny, and that he pegs the opening chapter of the novel to December 1869. Since the novel itself includes no specific time scale, his confidence might just conceivably be misplaced. As against the idea that the novel is set in 1860s, 70s, we might say the connections with other Hardy's novel only peg the book to that era if those other books are assumed to be set contemporaneously. And the grave of poor old Parson, thirdly disturbed by Channel Firing, could just as easily have been dug in the ground 80 as 40 years earlier, and otherwise the novel contains no reference to historical specific. Wessex is in many ways a rural location, out of time. 1869 saw the opening of the Suez Canal, 1870 the death of Dickens and the Franco-Prussian War, 1871 the Tichobon trial. None of these are mentioned in the novel. That's not Hardy's way. There is one piece of evidence which I'm not sure anyone has noticed to suggest the novel is actually set decades earlier. Although the novel's title claim otherwise, the turbulent affairs with her three suitors may mean that Bathsheba is in fact in the madding crowd rather than far from it. The abusive Sergeant Troy embodies this, especially as Bathsheba almost destroys her life by involving herself with him. By juxtaposing the title with the inner workings of the novel, Hardy has created a literary joke out of an otherwise sincere work. As his first successful novel and the first of the Wessex novel that took place in Hardy's fictionalized country, far from the madding crowd prefigured other works that return to the seemingly bucolic but in fact tumult setting. Tess of the d'Urville, published 17 years later, would also deal with issues of women's independence and vulnerability in such a world. Just as Bathsheba has to struggle against unfriendly natural forces, she also has to navigate a world that is made largely by and for men. This is particularly true once she takes over her uncle's farm as its mistress and owner. The attitudes of the novel's characters towards their new female supervisor range from admiring, condescending, and even the novel itself can indulge in a stereotyped analysis of specifically womanly attributes. What is unmistakable, however, is that it is quite rare in the novel's world for a woman to be a farmer or to be in a position of authority at all. From the beginning of Far From the Madding Crowd, nonetheless, we are given to expect that Bathsheba is not like other women. She is headstrong and confident. While many women would happily accept a marriage proposal from someone like Gabriel Oak, she refuses almost unthinkingly. Oak and Boldwood, perhaps because they fall in love with Bathsheba, don't seem to mind her position of female authority. Others, though, feel differently at the markets. For instance, people look askance at Bathsheba weighing seed and chatting with clients just like a man, with mingled respect, suspicion, and scorn. Meanwhile, the Greek chorus of farm hands continuously discusses her every move. Despite Hardy's radical attempt to portray Bathsheba as a confident and capable woman, the novel often slips into characterizations of her stereotypically female weaknesses. Such judgments might strike a contemporary reader as frustratingly old fashioned. Ultimately, though Bathsheba does prove herself able to manage a farm on her own, this portrayal of a successful female business owner is a challenge to Victorian assumptions about the role of women in public life. One of Bathsheba's principal weaknesses is her sense of pride, which is linked to vanity. When Gabriel Oak catches her looking at herself in the mirror, Bathsheba is simultaneously embarrassed and comforted by knowing that he has seen her at her worst. Bathsheba's pride suffers a number of other setbacks over the course of the novel, setbacks which she ultimately recognizes and accepts as proper ways of atoning for her earlier mistakes. Bathsheba's pride can also be linked to her thoughtlessness regarding other people. Confident and impetuous, she dashes off a Valentine to Boldwood without pausing to think of the possible ramifications of her action. In another way, Bathsheba's pride leads her down a difficult path and into dire consequences for herself. The first part of the book hews closely to Gabriel's perspective, for instance, but after he reaches Bathsheba's farm, the text mostly stays close to Bathsheba's own point of view to reveal her thoughts and emotions. The narrator, however, also moves between Bathsheba's Boldwood, Troy, and the Greek chorus of the farm hands at Warren's Malt House. In Far From the Madding Crowd, Hardy began to construct a fictional region of England, Wessex, which he calls in the perfect a partly real, partly dream country, and which he went on to further develop in a number of other novels. In some ways, Hardy describes this world and its inhabitants with all the world historical importance of places found in famous epics such as Homer's Ithaca or Troy. And yet, at the same time, Hardy deploys an ironic touch that works to deflate his mythical or biblical allusions. Thus, even as he treats his fictional English locale as a place of eminent significance, Hardy also reminds his readers of the much more pedestrian concern of modern rural life. The book is full of allusions to the Bible as well as to ancient Greek and Roman stories. For instance, Hardy describes his character Bathsheba after she kisses Troy as experiencing a kind of shock similar to Moses' amazement after God gives him a command. Hardy describes Gabriel Oak, meanwhile, as comparable to Minerva, referring to the Roman goddess of wisdom. These allusions rely on the Victorian reader's familiarity with the Bible and epic literature. They work to insist on the significance of the actions within the book by making the actions of ruler England seem comparable to the consequential action of myths. Even if Far From the Madding Crowd takes place in a partly dream country, one that is far from the metropolitan center of society, we are asked to take its concern and those of its characters seriously. Nonetheless, even as Hardy insists that the tragic events in the book should be taken seriously, his ironic touches constantly threaten to undercut the grandiosity of his biblical and classical allusions. One example is the mother of Cain Ball, who mixed up the Genesis story about Cain and Abel and named her son for the murderer rather than the victim. Again, readers would have been expected to laugh knowingly while the characters of Witherbury are subject to ironic teasing. Similarly, in some ways, the group of villagers like Joseph, Poorgrass, and Zan Kogan, who gather periodically for a pint of Warren's Malt House, function like an ancient Greek chorus by reflecting on the affairs of others and providing a running commentary on the events of the village. Their country pathos and joking demeanor, however, makes such a characterization humorously inapt. Irony then serves as an extra layer of complexity in Far From the Madding Crowd, prodding the reader to both recognize the grand allusions to canonical text and to smile at their deflation in a modern ruler world where illusions of grandeur can be woefully misplaced. Part of Bathsheba's struggle in deciding whom to marry and how to establish herself stems from her uncertain socio-economic status throughout the novel. At the beginning, Bathsheba and her aunt don't have much money, and yet Bathsheba is clearly not a peasant. She is well educated and seems to occupy a position much above her actual income. Oak, meanwhile, seems to be on his way to reaching the ruler middle class before the disaster of his sheep flock sends him back to fragility and insecurity and forces him to become a farmer's hand rather than a small landowner. His language nonetheless distinguishes him from other farm hands, whose country slang places them onto a low social and economic rung from which they presumably may never ascend. Thus, the characters of Bathsheba and Gabriel Oak suggest that while class defines opportunity and perception in rural England, it is not impossible for people, particularly smart, ambitious, and educated ones, to transcend it. Part of Bathsheba's attraction to Troy, meanwhile, is the glamour of his position as soldier. While he doesn't make a high income, he seems in many ways to be outside the closely watched and finely differentiated layers of rural economic positioning. Troy's situation suggests the desirability of being liberated from the petty and consuming class posturing that vexes the character who are more enmeshed in the social fabric. Troy's literal mobility, however, also allows him to hide his sins, including impregnating Fanny Robbins. Thus, the social fabric can be both oppressive and protective. Had Troy been more firmly rooted in society, Fanny and Bathsheba might have known, through his reputation, to stay away from him. Fanny, in turn, is perhaps the most vulnerable character in the novel. Her lack of class power ultimately condemns her to death. In some ways, Bathsheba's own class privilege makes her exempt from such a fate as Fanny's, but the pairing of these two women underlines how powerful the intersection of class and gender can be in the novel. While Fanny is doubly condemned as a lower class woman, Bathsheba too suffers from being taken advantage of by Troy, for instance, as a result of her own wealth coupled with sexual manipulation. Class, then, is shown to be a complex and powerful social category that is unevenly restrictive and has the potential of condemn people in some circumstances and save them in others. Class, in other words, is a social force with all the complexities and contradictions that characterize human society. The negotiation of power and privilege is at the center of Far From the Madding Crowd, and the trajectories of the characters suggest a social landscape marked by class divisions that are deep and defining, but nevertheless malleable. However, Hardy's characterization of the central characters complicates the novel's apparent optimism about class transcendence. When it was published, Far From the Madding Crowd was criticized for its portrayal or rural people as being above their actual class, and this rings somewhat true in light of the fact that Gabriel and Bathsheba seem to have resources and the characteristics that would not typically be available to the rural poor. There is a sense, then, that Hardy believes in class transcendence for those characters who seem to naturally fit more with the middle class than the poor class into which they were born. Conversely, class mobility seems unavailable to those characters like the farmhands, whose characteristics seem to make them stereotypically poor. Like unintentionally, then, Hardy gives readers the sense that class distinctions are not arbitrary cultural categories that shape and limit those who are born into them, but rather categories that reflect natural distinctions between people's individual natures. The way Hardy writes about them, it seems that Gabriel and Bathsheba can enjoy social mobility. This is not because they are defying an arbitrary category, but because they are shown to naturally belong to a category other than the one into which they were born. This essentialism about class may seem backward to a modern reader, and since Far from the Madding Crowd is, in many ways, a novel defiant about class, this idea may have seemed backward to Hardy too. The stubborn persistence of class essentialism in a novel that attempts to be optimistic about class mobility is therefore a fault line in the novel, and one that shows just how powerful the idea of class was in Victorian England. In a sense, then, class distinctions are shown to be vexed, not simply in the world of the novel, but also in the author's own mind. With this, I wrapped up the whole discussion regarding the background of Thomas Hardy's writing period. We may discuss other topics related to Victorian society in my next lecture. Till then, thank you and bye.